Hi, and welcome to the Mormon Meat Locker. I'm your host, Cable the Party Jenkins, here with my fellow co-host, Caroline Kingsley.
Hello. We are an LDS Singles podcast by LDS Singles for LDS Singles, and we bring you every week a different topic. Usually we have a different guest with us, and this week we have a social worker. Kazuyoshi is his name, and can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've done lots of different things in my life, so I got a lots of life experience too. But I went back to University of Texas, Austin. I got my master's in social work probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And I've worked in psych hospitals. I've worked with different people. Um, so I've had some interesting experiences. But I'm really interested in people kind of working through things and be able to have really good relationship with their family and friends, and especially for singles, hopefully find somebody we can find they'll spend the rest of our lives in eternity with. So that's kind of my background.
Perfect. And today we're going to talk about how our past affects our present. And can you tell us a little bit about what that means?
So, we either through our childhood growing up or through our experiences in our relationships or something like that, or, it could be multiple relationships, we begin to build patterns actually, because there's so much information out there in the world, so we begin to kind of start to filter some of the things so that we may be able to detect danger or bad situation before we actually get hurt or things like that. But the problem is, those things that work out really well for most of us many times don't work out really well when we meet that person that we may really care about, because we begin to react the same way. So one of the things that I like to always talk about is, if I kept, whacking you upside the head when you got up from the chair, would you look first? So that probably won't take very long, would it? So we spend years and years and years in relationship with your family or friends, and we build these habits that might not be so good with that person that you really care about. So that's kind of like best way to put it, I think.
Well, and it comes to mind Pavlov, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those who are unfamiliar with the studies he did, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while since high school psychology, but he would ring a bell, the
Mm-hmm.
dog would come, and he would feed the dog.
Right.
And he would keep ringing a bell, feeding, ringing a bell, feeding, and they would measure how much the dog would salivate every time. And it got to the point where every time they'd ring a bell, the dog would automatically salivate. So I think, like you're saying, it's the same sort of thing of when you're used to getting bopped on the head, you get used to like maybe, crouching when you're expecting something like that to happen. And certainly for those of us who have been through, well, probably everyone has been through relationships that haven't worked out how you hoped, or they've been bad in some way, or traumatic events from childhood, traumatic events from relationships. There's often triggers
Mm-hmm.
that bring up certain, those same emotions that you've dealt with at that point. You can be completely fine, and then you get a trigger, and it brings you right back to that moment, at least in my experience.
Right. So I think what's important about what you're saying is there a situation such that we have difficulty or problems in the relationship that we have? Yeah, certainly. But is the reaction greater sometime because we actually had these experiences in the past that we, for lack of a better term, haven't worked through, right? A lot of those things actually have emotional connections and connections to emotional health.
Mm-hmm.
So working through those things, I think, will help not only ourselves, but it'll allow us to be more emotionally available, actually. So I always kind of use the example of kind of sitting on a trash can lid, right? We keep stuff in the trash can lid with different emotions, whether if it's anger, sadness, or whatever. Well, next thing you know, we're trying to keep the trash can lid closed. So are we spending more time on trying to keep the lid closed? Or are we spending more time on more productive things, like a better term, like trying to connect with your loved ones or your significant other or your wife or husband, that kind of thing? As a matter of fact, I've seen people who spent a lot of time sitting on a trash can lid, and once they opened it up, they were like, wow, I didn't know I had this much energy, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy to keep that trash can lid closed.
Oh,
So,
I love how you put that. I was actually in a relationship somewhat recently where my personality, my behavior reminded him of someone he had dated. And even though we're actually quite different, he kind of made the assumption, his brain made the connections that I was actually this person from the past, and that I was going to make the same decisions, and I was doing the same thing, behind the scenes. And it's interesting how those things connect to your brain. You don't even realize it.
right.
And then you make assumptions about someone and their behavior. And I think we all do it to some extent, because it's how our brains work, is to make connections. And then you make assumptions about, I've seen this before. Whether you realize it or not, you're making that connection that, I know what that person's like.
Right. Yeah, and I think, what you're saying is very important, not just in our dating relationship, but someday when we actually meet that person, we're going to have to be patient enough to say, this is why I married this person, and it might look like something that I've experienced, but maybe it's not. I think that's why the Brethren always talks about, especially Elder Holland talks about the fact that, doubt your doubt first.
Yeah.
That's why that's important, I think.
Well, and I think it's important to be self-aware, to realize what's really driving your thoughts and your reactions to things, and sit there and think, is this really fair? Because I'll have reactions to things, and then it takes me a moment to be like, wait, am I being really fair how I'm judging this situation? And is it just an emotional knee-jerk reaction based on X, Y, and Z? But I like what you said about how much energy it takes to keep these emotions. And that's something I'm working on really hard right now, is just to let things go. I think it's the hardest thing. When you feel hurt by something, when you feel really disappointed, it's just to let those emotions go, because all we want to do is just clench onto them. But it costs us so much.
Right.
And really, so much is based on illusion, something that doesn't exist at all.
Right. And, for me, I feel like all these emotional things are actually no different than cleaning your house out. The reason I say that is because if you decided to wait to clean your house for 5 years, how bad would that be? Right? Whereas once you get it cleaned out, and if you find a way to keep those emotions worked with and keep it clean, then it doesn't actually take that much. That's what will allow you and all of us to connect with our friends and family and all the people that we care about, and like I said, especially hopefully that person that we get to marry someday.
I love that analogy. I mean, I've been thinking recently, in actually cleaning my house, when I have that item that I may use one day, you think about the cost of storing it, and it's the same thing. What is the cost of storing this negative emotion?
Right. And what you said is actually very important, because I think human being operates in such a way that whatever is going to give you greater reward, for lack of a better term, you will choose to do so. Some people, safety and not dealing with those emotions and those things are difficult, may not be on a list right now, and that's okay. I think the first step is to accept the fact that maybe I'm not ready to deal with it right now. Or, go ahead. Oh, okay, I thought I heard something. So, so I think that's kind of the important part, is that you're recognizing the fact that those things occur, and some people are ready to do it, some people aren't. It's okay, whatever it is, which kind of stretches toward, I don't necessarily think that it's bad to be sad or angry, but what you do with it and get it worked through, so that we're not keeping hold of those things and, try to go back to the Heavenly Father with it. Because Heavenly Father's place is a happy place, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I know. So I think those things need to get worked through beforehand. So find a way to deal with it appropriately and in a healthy manner while we're here.
Right. Yeah, one thing that I've noticed, especially in the single scene, is that you date one person and they do something, and it's like Caroline was talking about earlier, where something she did reminded that person of someone else they had dated.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the problem is when you start treating people based on those things, because the other person, like, if I'm treating someone based on something that's happened in my past, that other person has no idea what's going on. Like they're going to be sitting there saying, I don't know why he's acting like this. So unless you can actually, if that comes up, you have to kind of be able to talk to him and tell him, this particular action is a trigger for me of such and such, right? Otherwise, they're sitting there saying, I don't know why he's upset at all. And then you're sitting there thinking they should know, but in reality, what you went through was with a different person, not with them.
Right. That's very true. And I honestly believe that anything can be dealt with or going through in a relationship as long as we are willing to communicate appropriately, actually, with the person that you deal with. So, my personal experience, actually, I've been single for a while, and I've dealt with some emotional things and things like that. And one day, I was out and about, and just this emotion totally whacked me all of a sudden. And what I'm finding is that as much as we sometimes think that we have things dealt with, including me, who's dealt with therapy methods and all that stuff, unless we verbalize them, I don't think you really get worked through because I think it just processes a thought, not emotions, because you're thinking about it, which is different than dealing with emotions that you have. So I think that's kind of an important distinction. And a lot of times we talk about things in I feel terms, but we may actually be thinking about something and say in terms of I feel a certain way. So I think it's important to distinguish the two as well.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that I thought of when you were talking about that is to make sure we're using terms that both people understand. Because you may be saying, such a thing like, for instance, I'm from South Africa, so, you sit here and say you're trying to keep the trash can lid on, whereas someone in South Africa would say rubbish can, So if you're not using the same terminology, you might be sitting there telling someone how you feel or what your triggers are, or whatever, having this conversation, and they may not be understanding what you're saying. So you're really not accomplishing anything because you're not on the same page. So if you're not understanding, you just need to make sure that you're understanding what the other person is saying. You may have to explain some terminology you use, but if that's what you have to do, just make sure that you're both understanding what you're saying so that the conversation can actually be of worth.
Right.
I think men and women having misunderstandings in conversation because you're speaking different languages, I can't even fathom.
Right.
That would never happen.
And guys are gonna have to be patient enough to explain it if you want to have a good relationship with women. A woman's gonna have to sometimes get that he may not want to talk about it right now. But I think it's always a balance and compromise between the two. I think, which is what builds a relationship to begin with.
I absolutely love what you said about the comparing the terms with rubbish and trash. I mean, I think that's a perfect example of ways that, men and women in general, to really use broad strokes, that we do think in different terms and we do communicate differently, but also, every individual communicates completely differently, and it's so easy. We know through texting how easy it is to just misunderstand tone, but the same thing happens during face-to-face conversations, and if we can take the time to be just a little bit more patient before we react, to ask the questions about exactly what they mean. I know probably the most times I've gotten in bigger confrontations with someone, once you talk it out, you realize, okay, we're not so far apart on what page we're on, but you jump to a conclusion without asking the questions, wait, what did you mean about that?
Right. Yeah, I think, relationship, the most important part is asking more questions than coming up with a conclusion what we want to say or what we should say. I think most of us, including myself, are thinking about what we're going to say next rather than listening to people, and we hate, silences, right? So people try to fill silences. I think we need to learn to be okay to listen and have silence to think about it for a minute before you respond. And I think that goes for just everybody in the world. That's kind of what I see in the world, is that people don't like silence. So
silence isn't a terrible thing. it can allow you to kind of internalize what they just said and figure out what you want to say. A lot of times when we respond very emotionally, it can cause a lot of problems. So we need to just make sure that we take in what they said. We ask questions if we want to, make sure that we're understanding, make sure that we're on the same page, make sure that we understand what it is they're saying, and not just take necessarily what they're saying at face value, because sometimes when you do that, that's even worse, because you take it and you might assume it to mean one thing when in reality it means a completely different thing is what they're trying to say. So if we just ask some questions just to make sure we know what they're saying, and then once we know what they're saying, take a minute to internalize it and then respond.
Right. And more honest, I think, we're each other in a relationship, the closer we'll have a chance to get. Yeah, it'll be more difficult because there's so much honesty in it. But at the same time, one thing that I always try to tell people is that say what you need to say instead of editing what you're thinking, but present it differently. Be kind when you present it, but don't also not say when you're upset about something or when you need to have some situation that you need to take care of. It needs to be said, but we just maybe need to say it differently.
Yeah.
I like that. Well, and I was thinking too, as Cable was talking, that when you're talking about, clarify with communication, but even beyond the verbal communication, like we talked about, that someone, like we definitely have our connections that we make based on our past. And we know that other people do that too. So if we can be patient and maybe realize or be aware of where they may be coming from and when they may behave, and it's you can only do so much because they have to communicate to some extent, but they may not even know what's going on. So it might be good just to be aware that they have a past and they may be making connections that aren't necessarily fair. If you can be aware that that's happening, maybe you can ask questions that help to clarify things as well.
Right. Can I, since you said something about people not being at work, can I address something that we don't often think about actually? We all kind of tend to have roles in our family, right? So those things actually pop up in our relationship sometime too. I have an example of somebody I met who had got into several relationships, but she keeps picking blamers. Well, what happened was when she was growing up, she was blamed for everything. So even though it was not a pleasant thing, she actually got used to being blamed, and as a matter of fact, she was being responsible for bad behaviors of people, especially husbands and boyfriends. So I think those are kind of things that we also need to look at as far as the past things goes as well. By the way,
that's a really good point.
So, and I don't know. I mean, unfortunately, our parents are not perfect, so we all have certain things that we learn and we make conclusions as kids. So, we all need to be willing to look at what our lives look like and see if we can make it better.
Well, and we talked a lot about the negative, stuff from our childhood, from our past relationships, from our past life, and not past life, you know what I mean, before our present life. But, there's obviously so many great things that inform our life, too. And so, we're not all just trying to get past the bad experiences, but we have, so many wonderful things that inform us, too. And even the negative can inform our lives in a positive way, in a way. The Cable, I think you had a movie group that went to Inside Out once. And I have the right one, where you can see inside this little girl's head, and it's all cartoons, and you can see, in this world, how they manipulate her emotions in a way, and in the movie they were trying to remove all of her negative emotions because they love this little girl so much. They just want happiness for her. But you see how destructive it is in the movie, and there were a lot of people who weren't crazy about it, but what I loved was the takeaway that you can't remove the negative from your life because it informs you, and it's important to have that. So I think it's still it has place in our lives, and as well as, again, we have some good things from our past too.
Right. Yeah, and you know, I think I certainly know that everybody has difficult situations that we're all dealing with, and it's not always, you know, roses and unicorns, but we by accepting those things that are happening to us, I think we can also learn to deal with things better. And I'm probably going to get backside the head by somebody, but you know, I truly have had my experiences such that it's that way. So, you know, we can learn from a lot of things that are difficult, but I think those things actually make us stronger, and I think make us do better.
Well, and certainly, as cliche as it is, it really makes us compassionate, and it helps other people. Because I know for me, when I am going through something and my friends are saying, oh, hey, like I get it because I've been there, you know, and they can tell me about their experiences, it certainly helps me.
Right. Yeah, and you know, I think it's time to start to wrap up and stuff like that. I think the most important part, though, is that all these things actually we're talking about, as difficult as they may be, they are about extending compassion to ourselves, actually, letting ourselves heal, letting ourselves do the things that we need so that we might be healthy, so that we can help other people, or we can build better relationships. So it's really about us, and it's not selfish, because a lot of people think it is, but it's not. If we're not well, we can't help other people.
I love that. And I've been putting a lot of thought into that lately of like, and I'll beat myself up when I fall short of my ever high expectations. And I think, you know, or when, you know, something from the past, because I'm like, I don't want to be affected by my past, and sometimes you can't help it. And, but I think, how would I react if someone was coming to me with this problem, or if someone had a bad day, someone stumbled in something in their life? Would you sit there and berate them? You know, you wouldn't, you know, especially if they're a close friend of yours. You would be like, you know what, it's not a big deal in the scheme of things, and you'll explain it, and you'll give them a hug, but we don't do that to ourselves. And, you know, if we treated ourselves as well as we treated our close friends, we'd be so much better off.
Well, the other thing problem might be good for parents is that would you say that to your children?
Oh.
That's a big one, and we say that in our heads all the time, and repeat it, but we don't always say that to that our children, because it's not a kind word. So that's something good to think about.
Embrace your inner child.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This is a wonderful discussion, and if anyone has anything to add, we'd love to see it on our Facebook page.
Thank you for having me, and you guys are great.
Thanks, Kazuyoshi. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for joining in, and we'll see you next week on the Mormon Meat Locker.
Bye.